I'm just sat here talking with Kayleigh Davies, who's one of our graduates and teacher. I thought we were going to talk a bit about the relation between religious belief and evidence.
Yeah, I think it'd be quite good for pupils to have a background knowledge of belief, where it comes from, whether or not it is always based on evidence, and whether the Bible could be used as evidence.
Because we tend to think that all belief in society is the same. All belief is based on kind of empirical evidence, and that's that. And that, of course, is not always the case.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the beliefs that many of us hold are based on guesses, presumptions, evidence, the beliefs that our parents had, the beliefs that our friends have. And if we actually produce evidence to prove them, it'd be quite difficult. Bringing that round to religious belief, of course, in the Bible, it seems rather odd to many biblical scholars that people treat the Bible like a kind of a textbook, when it doesn't ever seem to kind of match rather very well as that. You know, it's as we were talking about before we started. You know, the Bible's a collection of stories and myths, and it was written by different people at different times. It's been compiled in sometimes quite organised and sometimes less organised processes of choosing what is included, what is excluded. So to treat this collection of ancient and less ancient stories as a kind of scientific source book seems kind of to miss the point. Is that?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Because religious beliefs often come from different sorts of evidence, and that evidence might be not like the kind of evidence you do in a science lab where you take two test tubes and a little colour thing, you work it out. The evidence that often leads to religious belief might be more personal. So if you talk to religious people and you kind of probe why do you believe this, one possible response is to say I had certain kinds of experience, saying what you might kind of deem as religious or spiritual experiences, that they choose to interpret, or they, because of various factors, interpret as evidence. But I don't think that's always the case either. I think some people aren't able to point to a day they suddenly felt like they were having a kind of a communing with the spirit, but they just have a general feeling. It's a more kind of persistent feeling of there being something there in the universe. So that's a kind of religious experience of a more kind of subtle sort. And then there are people who say, I don't actually have evidence, but I believe anyway.
Yeah.
You know, because we tend to somehow, if we treat religion as too much just like a science that has rather shaky evidence, as some atheists don't really kind of appreciate perhaps, and they say your evidence isn't as good as our evidence, therefore you're wrong, we're right. So there. You know, seems to completely miss out this idea of faith. You know, it's so important for many religious groups. It's the idea of that faith is important. But I think, and you find it particularly in Christianity, but also quite strongly in other religions, it's not meant to be easy. I think we sometimes have a stereotype that I wish I had faith and could believe that, and therefore my life would be easy. But people have, within, say, Christianity, always struggled with their faith. You know, the idea that people who've got faith in God therefore believe in life after death and don't have to worry about anything ever again would be nice. But I'm not sure it accurately captures their experience. Their experience is often, I think, of having days when they don't have faith, having years when they don't have faith, having experiences that test their faith all the time. So I think faith is the idea of faith as something easy is a problem, but it's what I think underlies a lot of people's belief, is saying I don't have proof that this is the case, and yet I want to believe it, and I do believe it, and I find it hard to believe it some days, but I still am choosing to believe this and have faith. And that's very hard for people who don't have that belief to kind of work out what that feels like intellectually, I think. But I think that's what I think underlies religious belief more. And do you think that gets at the issue?
I think it does. And one question that I would ask is whether you think it's a lot to do with the psychology of human brains, thinking, thoughts, maybe touching upon the soul, or even their upbringing, and whether or not that therefore affects their interpretation of the world.
I'm sure your upbringing has a huge impact, and so we see, people who are brought up with deeply religious cultures and groups and parents and things clearly replicate those beliefs over time. But of course, that's in conversation with a much wider culture, a bigger culture about whether it's culturally acceptable to reject your religion, to come to different views, whether that's fashionable or not fashionable. So all these things are involved in the interplay of sociological factors, but also individual psychological factors. I think how much people... but I think the psychology of belief is actually, as you know, having done psychology as well as philosophy and ethics, psychology of belief is actually quite complicated. But it's very easy, I think, for young people and even for older people, when they're writing about other people's beliefs, to use a very broad brush, to think, oh well, it's because they were brought up a Muslim or brought up a Christian. If they were clever like me, they'd think this. So it's very easy to be simplistic about other people's beliefs. And actually, why a certain person comes to have a certain belief is the outcome of quite a lot of factors. A lot of psychological factors, a lot to do with their personal narrative, where they've had certain kind of experiences, and these much broader social factors. So I think belief, we think of it, is it good evidence or not? Should I believe that or not, based on evidence? I think when we start to probe psychology of belief and sociological factors more deeply, it turns out to be a much more complicated business.